Good morning. Oh, it's definitely working. Thank you so much for having me here to speak to you today. It's a real privilege to be able to share something of my story with you. Many people have not met someone like me before, and we are talked about very publicly and very negatively quite often. But lots of people have an opinion about us but don't necessarily have a perception of the truth. And I often say that, when you've met one transgender person, you've met one transgender person. We're all different and our stories are different, and this is mine. When I was 6, there was a day that changed my life. Outside Mrs. Cashman's classroom at my primary school in Southampton, I knew that I felt different. People kept calling me a boy, and I thought, I don't really understand why you're calling me that, because that doesn't make any sense to me at all. That's not how I feel like I am inside. I realised at that stage even that I felt like a girl inside. And I didn't have the language of knowing what it meant to be transgender. It was just that simple. I felt wrong. And apart from feeling very confused that day, I also remember a deep sense of shame. And I thought to myself, I must never tell anyone this. They won't understand. The only person I felt I could actually tell was God. I wasn't a person of faith, and my family didn't go to church. But I began a nightly ritual that lasted for years after that point. I would time myself for an hour every evening, and I would pray that when I woke up, that God will have fixed the problem, and that I would be the girl I felt like I was inside. Age 17, and now completely sure that I wasn't a boy, but even more confused by that, I met with God properly for the first time, and my journey of faith really began. As well as listening to the idea that God loved me, I thought, well, maybe God could actually rid me of this awful feeling inside. And the fight of my life began. At this point, prayers that I had been praying changed. I began, and so I wanted you to hear the Hannah verse today, because I began literally with tears and with groaning. I cried out to God to take this away from me. Don't let me feel like this. I confessed my sins to my church leaders and to my house group. I had prayer ministry and even conversion therapy and counselling. Everything that anyone ever suggested to me, I tried ceaselessly to not feel like this. I wanted it to be taken away. Everyone in my church who I came out to agreed, yeah, this is wrong. We need to fight this. This is the right thing to do. Never was the possibility that it was okay even ever considered. Everyone confirmed to me, yeah, this is wrong. When I was 19, I first felt God's call on my life to ordained ministry. I remember God whispering the words of Isaiah 61 into my ear. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. Over the months after hearing that, many people I knew and complete strangers kept wandering up to me and saying, I think God's telling me I'm supposed to tell you this first. I sat in the chapel at college and opened the Bible on the chair in front of me, and remember as I opened it, a piece of paper fell out, and on the piece of paper had that verse. And by that stage I was like, okay, God, I've got it. That's what you want me to do. So the church I was part of hired me, and I began working with them and training, but before much longer, I just knew I couldn't continue. I was losing the fight against being trans, feeling like that, and I just felt I was tricking the church into having a sinner on their staff. And I gave up and just let go of that calling. In my 20s, I got married, and despite everything, I was really successful professionally and had 3 lovely children. But my life was just like a cycle of shame, it felt like, all the time. I spent time confessing and, like Hannah, bargaining with God to try and take this away. And then I'd feel the need to present as Sarah because it was so sad. And that was followed by guilt that I'd let God down, I'd let my family down, I'd let my church down. It wasn't, though, until my early 30s, really, where the dam broke. I was going for coffee with one of my non-church friends, and all the really important things in my journey towards today happen in really glamorous places. So if you can picture a Starbucks in Milton Keynes, you'll be kind of somewhere along the lines to kind of where I thought. And so I told her everything that day. And in response, she said something that I thought I would never hear. She said, "I love you even more now that I know this about you." And after 25 years of being told I was completely unacceptable, that affirmation changed everything. I began to realise there were people out there who would be lovely. I'd just never met them in the church. And so I began over time to come out to more people, including memorably my friend Sean, who said, "You're now the most interesting person I know." I said, "Sean, you've got quite a low bar of interesting in your life." But I was really grateful. But as you can imagine, this newfound change brought me on a collision course with my church. And eventually we parted ways, and I drifted for a long while, churchless. I did continue to have a faith, but I just thought, I'm never going to find Christians who will accept me. And I believed that God wouldn't accept me either. And I just thought, what's the point? And then our amazing, fathomless God intervened. The passage you heard from the gospel earlier was my breakthrough moment with God. Now, I don't know whether some of you might be skeptical at this point, but I really did, through one verse, one scripture, felt like God stepped into the whole situation. Matthew 7 verse 9 says, "Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone?" I spent over 30 years asking God to give me bread. And bread in my case was release from being transgender, from this feeling inside. But all I felt I'd got from my earnest begging was a stone. So I kind of realised that one of these things is either true. Either God doesn't give bread and God actually does give stones and that verse isn't true. Or that I'd been given bread all along and was just mistaking it for stone. That thought, I didn't build a whole theology out of it, but that thought changed everything again. I thought maybe, just maybe, God might be able to love me as I am. I'd never entertained the possibility before, but once I did, I saw how many verses of affirmation of God's love there were within the Bible. And it was so much better than being loved even by my friend in Milton Keynes. Things got really difficult for me about 9 years ago, and I realised there was only one direction that it was going to go in, that I needed to transition. I think sometimes people think that's an easy decision, lightly made, but it's really not. For many of my friends, it has meant losing jobs, friends, homes, families, children. I lost a partner and a home, but honestly, the thing I feared the most was losing my kids. Didn't know how they would react to the news. In August 2017, we'd been on holiday together, a holiday of 2 weeks that I spent the entire time just dreading coming home, because I knew that when I came home, I had to tell them, and I didn't know whether they would want to be with me anymore. I've never been so frightened, honestly, in my whole life as I was that day. I knew I still needed to transition, but what if? What if they don't cope with it? I remember sitting down at the kitchen table with them and said, look, your mum and I are splitting up, and you can imagine they were shocked and they demanded a reason. They wanted to know why. And I said, well, do you know what it means if someone says they're transgender? And they said, duh, of course. It's like, okay, things have moved on a little bit now. I said, well, that's what's going on. I'm transitioning. And long story short, that day I realised what absolutely incredible human beings they are. And I remember after they said, it's fine, we still love you, we still care for you, I burst into tears, and I didn't realise the kind of weight that I was carrying at that point on my shoulders. And later on that day, I went to see them again and checked in to make sure they were okay and see if everything was all right. And despite everything I told them, that I was transitioning, that we were separating, all that kind of stuff, they said, we can't believe you cried. I was like, that's what you took away from that whole conversation? You are really as amazing as I thought. But that was my last day living as male. I transitioned the next day, and I was determined at that point to get my relationship with the church back on track. I despaired, though, of finding somewhere, and many of my friends had struggled too. And so I went on the Inclusive Church website. People wonder why, if that's ever important. It really is. Because that told me that in the whole of North Yorkshire, where I live, the only place that was inclusive was Ripon Cathedral. And so I went along and asked them if they really were inclusive. And they were. In many churches, the view of LGBT folk is, well, we'll have them in our church till God changes them. Or they're welcome, but only if they warm the pews. The cathedral didn't take that view and encouraged me to fully engage with church life. I was their PCC secretary for a long time, a school governor. I helped with messy cathedrals, Lizzie mentioned earlier. And work has been amazing as well, and lots of support and love has brought me such joy. I look in the mirror every day and I see the authentic me. And I just think that's just absolutely amazing. But to round the story out, so about 4 years ago, I went on an LGBT retreat to St Binos in North Wales. A retreat I now co-lead, but on the last morning of the retreat, they asked us to pray together, specifically for anything that we felt that we'd regretted, that God had called us to, or God had wanted for us, and our gender identity or sexuality had stopped us. I basically spent the next 2 hours sobbing because all that regret of what I felt God had called me to, just all resurfaced again. And so I thought, well, I'm going to push a few doors open to see kind of what happens. And so trepidatiously I did, thinking they're going to just shut them in my face. That's not going to happen. And bit by bit, door by door, through my church, through the DDO, through another number of bishops you have to be interviewed by, and lots of other people. And then eventually into the door of St Hild, as Lizzie said earlier. And after that huge journey of many ups and downs, where I sometimes despaired of ever really my relationship with God surviving intact, hopefully next June, year time, I will stand in front of the bishop and be ordained. I just think that's an amazing end to the story. So thank you for your time, thank you for listening, and I think we're going to do some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We have some time for questions. I have a few questions sort of thought through, prepared, but if there are any others that come to you while we're doing this, Sarah's very graciously agreed to take whatever we've got to throw at her.
Questions.
My first question...
I mean, it's not been unknown, but you know.
We're on the Inclusive Church website. I think they would have a word with us. So my first question is, are there any questions we should or shouldn't ask you, or, you know, if as you're here to speak on behalf of the entire trans community?
So there are really kind of two, I guess, that kind of most people really feel very uncomfortable asking. And so one of them is obviously, what did your name used to be? And I do get asked that question quite a lot, which is, We in the trans community, it's called your dead name. That's almost how it kind of feels to you. It's like you kind of put that behind you. The other one is that you do get asked from time to time where you're up to in terms of your medical processes. And I remember recently someone asked me that question. They said, "Have you transitioned?" I was like, "Yes." And they said, "No, have you transitioned?" I was like, so I looked at them and said, "Are you asking me about my genitals?"
Okay.
And they looked horrified at that point and realised that was probably, I don't normally do anything that mean, but I was just like, yeah. So
the same as with anyone else. If we're not your boyfriend, doctor, or lawyer, we wouldn't need to know.
Yeah, why would you need to know that?
Okay.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of, for me, it's thinking about, why am I asking this question?
Yeah.
Am I asking this because there's a genuine kind of need for me to ask this question, or is it just curiosity? And then that's the ones I would kind of just weigh up whether they make sense.
Okay, but everything else is on the table.
Yeah,
So,
for me, yeah, certainly, yeah.
Do you have any questions? Yes, Victoria does.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your story. I've never met anybody transgender before, and I know it's such a tricky subject in some domains, and I'm gutted that it's a tricky subject in the church domain, and I just want to thank you so much for your honesty and openness for sharing with us today and helping to educate and just get rid of so much of that stigma that shouldn't be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay, I have a question then, and if you've got some, keep thinking. We'll come back to them. We'll alternate. My first question is, what has helped in church? Having found places that are working, I couldn't be more pleased that it's a Church of England setting that has helped, but some haven't. What has helped? I guess. What can we glean so far? Finding a church on the Inclusive Church website, that's fantastic. Good news, and that's affirming to us that we've joined that we can be a safe space, people can find us. What else has helped, and what hasn't helped?
Yeah, so that definitely helped, and it meant that I knew I would, when I was going into a church, that it was it was okay. Because believe it or not, I went on a lot of church websites, and a lot of them said, "We are inclusive." When I delved into that, I realised it's because they let children into their services. Which was just appalling. I mean, it's just kind of that, there's something about that kind of openness to say we are that. And occasionally from the front, someone saying and reiterating that, and just, in reality, I'm really happy to come and tell my story, but it is kind of one of the most boring things about me, really. In reality, I do so many more interesting things. So it's kind of, most trans people don't want it all to be about kind of their transness, so actually just including them as who they are and what they are called to do, what God has got for them, is fantastic. And occasionally they will want to talk about being trans, and that will be, there'll be something going on. Like you were saying earlier, at the moment there are some really difficult things kind of going on in the world around us. So kind of understanding that and being supportive of that when people need you to be is really helpful.
Okay. And I should make it clear that the first conversation I ever had with Sarah, and that most of us had with Sarah, had nothing to do with her being trans at all. She led our PCC Vision Day on where we're going next. This was just some follow-up thing that came up from something else. So I don't want you all to feel that we're just, making use of Sarah's trans stuff. This is not the most interesting thing about her at all. Yeah. Okay.
Although for me, it is really helpful that if you've never met someone, hopefully my words have helped you to understand the next person you meet, and that's kind of the gift for me, is giving the opportunity for that, really.
Thank you. Yeah. What hasn't helped in churches? What have been the hard things, and what? Okay, everybody here is lovely. All of us, especially me, put our feet in things, right? I have said the wrong thing, but have you all done that? Yeah. What are the things, apart from those couple of questions, what are the things that would be unhelpful that we can maybe save ourselves from going, "Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have done that"? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. To be honest, I mean, and those of you who know trans people will kind of know this. There are some people who are very, very sensitive, but often they've had really traumatic kind of backgrounds and lots of kind of rejection. For me, there's very little you can do that I'm going to be that bothered about. I think it's where kind of, often when things are done that are very uninclusive, if you like. So kind of, language is used in a way that I feel very excluded from. So kind of, often when there's lots of kind of coupley things, or there's lots of kind of, here are the men and women, for example, it will be kind of, there'll be trans people in the audience who don't identify in either direction. So it's kind of, it's just remembering that people aren't, they have a different worldview, I guess, in the way they're looking at things can be really helpful.
Okay, so some of that, we hear a lot of stuff about, not bothering too much about all that woke language and things like that, but actually being careful with our language will make a difference to the very small number, but of vulnerable people.
Yeah, I think it is helpful, and it's really interesting because the woke thing is really frustrating, because actually it's become kind of demonized, for want of a better kind of word, really. But actually, it's just about caring for someone else, and it's not just whether they're trans or LGBT in some description, but whether they are, they're disabled, or they're kind of or there's some other kind of thing that is going on in their world. Just kind of bearing that in mind is not too much to ask for. Just basic courtesy and politeness. They're not looking for kind of, you to change the world for them. They're quite happy to fit in the world you've kind of created most of the time, but it's just having that little bit of kind of understanding, I guess.
Yeah, okay, so we should be a bit more aware, and it would be, I guess, if we know people, we can say, are we getting this right? And check in with you to the side from time to time.
And they're generally happy for you to do that. And if, often if something's going wrong, then they will often come and tell you. Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah.
I have one more. Anything else from any of you? Any questions? Anything else to add? Sarah, Shirley. Sorry.
It's all right, dear. Could I just ask, did you ever talk to your parents or your teachers about how you felt when you were a child?
So interestingly, so obviously, I know you might not be able to tell this, I'm 50. Thank you for saying I look younger, that's very kind of you. So when I was 6 was in 1980. And so at that point, I would never have had a conversation with a teacher, for example. That wouldn't have happened. And that realization I had that day that I can't tell anyone this, I didn't tell anyone for probably at least 10 years after that. Was the first time I came out. I came out to a couple of friends, and they rejected me completely, and I went back into hiding again. It wasn't until kind of my late teens that I told some church folk. I eventually told my mum, 9 years, about 12 or so years ago in the end. So as I was kind of starting to think about transitioning, I told her, and she was amazing, and I wished I told her before. But I think times have changed and people are more open than they were. So, the fact that I know some governments are doing their best to kind of change this, but actually being in a place where your children can tell you, and that you kind of are supportive of that in whatever way you need to be, is amazing and really, really, really helpful. But no, I never felt like I could. But when I did, my mum was incredible. And I have it on my chest of drawers at home. I have this little heart that she gave me about a couple of weeks after I transitioned that says my mum was the kind of person who would go into a card shop and spend hours finding the right words. And she gave me this little heart that kind of talks about the kind of daughter that she sees me as. And that was just incredible. To have that kind of affirmation from her was just amazing, absolutely amazing. Yeah.
Okay, one more.
I'm really conscious of your wife and children. How can the church best support that side of things?
It's really tough, isn't it? Because so the church I was part of, I never have a bad word to say about them, because in reality, what I got, I asked for. I wanted for most of my life to find a way out of this. And so all they were doing really in reality, I kind of regret that no one said, it could be okay though, that would have been really nice. But it kind of happened. So my wife's still part of that church, so still part of that kind of way of thinking really. And so gets support in that kind of direction. My children, are very mixed on church. In fact, the challenge really for them is that they've seen where church led me to, and that's kind of caused them heartache, I think, really. My hope is that at some stage they will see that actually it's changed and that things are different and that they can trust that it's going to be okay. But I think unless the people are in kind of in your church and in a relationship with you, I think it's quite difficult to intervene and help in that situation. I think you kind of they're almost separate. If they are part of your church, though, I think listening and just always listening and just kind of giving them time and space to kind of be willing to speak is a good thing is good to be able to do. But you kind of have to have the relationship with them because it's a really tough thing for them to discuss. There's often a lot of embarrassment around it, which is ridiculous, but there is. Yeah.
I guess my last one then is about how we can help. How can we be good allies? If we know a trans person, we can be a good ally clearly by listening and not judging, and you've been very clear about that. But how can we be, in general, as individuals and as a church, good allies, especially and there's so much negative stuff and coming out of America at the minute. How can we help?
Yeah, I think, we've said most of it really. I've got to have a list, my allies list of things. That would
Will you send that to us?
Yeah, of course, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are kind of 5 things which mostly we've kind of discussed in there. But I think probably it's kind of, things like not assuming they're an expert on every bit of everything that goes on. I mean, I get asked really regularly about New Zealand weightlifters and African runners and and what I think about kind of trans people in sport. And I'm, it's not that I deliberately remain uninformed, but not everyone's an expert on everything. Yeah, it's kind of I always love it when I get to spend time with people who are experts in diversity and inclusion, that kind of stuff. So I'm like, oh, that's really interesting because that's not my thing at all. So kind of don't assume that it's that assumption that every trans person's the same, is going to have the same experience, know the same things, etc. is tough, really, I think. So not doing that, I think. But also, as you said, kind of, we are being attacked horribly, horribly at the moment. I mean, literally every day. If you look at the number of news articles about trans people, given that we are 0.5% of the population, it's absolutely, just criminal, really. And I'm not sure there's anything we can do, but your prayers are appreciated. If you have contact with anyone who you can bend their ear, because it's really hard work. But I always worry at the moment for my allies, my friends who are allies, because I don't want to put you in a situation where I made one kind of comment on Twitter about a year or so ago and then got harassed in the most brutal and rude way for such a long time afterwards. So, we're not praying, supporting, knowing it's going on, having someone who's going, that was really rubbish this week, wasn't it? It's just a really helpful place to start, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get the rest of your list and we'll put that in the next family news because I think we need to wrap up. Thank you so much. We'll do this again in about an hour, but it's time to move on and do communion, which feels odd and different, but actually this is what the church does, and there are glimmers of goodness. That's what we look for when we're doing that thankfulness bit at the start of services. Where has God been good? And church has been a problematic part of Sarah's story, as we've heard, but he has brought her back to here, and not long from now she'll be leading communion. What a privilege it'll be at some point to come and have communion from you. But for now, you get to have it from us, and Lizzie will lead us through the rest of that. Thank you.